I know the title of this video seems to be asking a fairly obvious question. To AAV enthusiasts, the question of why tanks use camo is a no-brainer. However, not everyone has the same degree of interest. In the past, I have seen a few comments asking why tanks use camouflage, especially on the video about stealth tanks. To most people, tanks are these big lumbering machines designed to soak up enemy fire. Why would you bother trying to hide something so monstrous and huge? Wouldn't it be really time consuming to paint something that big? And wouldn't it be annoying to repaint it when you go to a different theater? These are actually pretty good questions. While the question is pretty easy to answer, it does allow us to explore the history and technology. Tank camo actually goes all the way back to World War I, when tanks were first made and used. During this time, camouflages were made by simply asking artists to create a pattern that matched a certain environment. And this trend continued into the Cold War. But during World War I, tanks were largely used in wide open environments with little to no cover. You'd think there wouldn't be a good reason to use camo, and this is probably what people think when they think of modern tanks as well. However, even if there's no cover or concealment, camouflage can still be useful. It will still make the tank a little harder to spot, and will make it a bit more difficult to determine the tank's orientation, especially since optics weren't amazing at that time. As the war continued, camouflage use did fall by the wayside, but not because the camo itself was ineffective. The issue was that many tanks used rhomboid-style tracks in order to maximize their trench crossing ability, but since that track came to the top of the tank, it would end up dumping mud over itself, rendering the camouflage more or less useless. Since the camouflage took a decent amount of time to apply, they decided to simply paint the tanks brown instead. It would still blend in with the muddy terrain, and would be much more efficient. In the Second World War, camouflage made a resurgence. Environments were much more varied, with theaters existing in Europe, Italy, Africa, and the Pacific. Tank mobility and flexibility also improved, allowing them to perform more roles where camouflage would be useful. Instead of supporting assaults on trenches, tanks were now performing ambushes, exploitation, and reconnaissance. Tank crews began to use alternative methods of concealing their tanks, such as camo nets or attaching foliage to their vehicles. These methods were generally more effective than using paint, since they broke up the vehicle's outline more, and they took less time to apply. They were less durable though. During the Korean War, US engineers determined that their tanks were emitting significant infrared signatures from their mufflers, signatures that could be detected with the right equipment. To make these signatures less visible, lengthy research programs were kicked off. The end goal was achieved through several methods. These include changing how tank components were arranged, using low-emission materials, and decoys. One of the greatest innovations was the creation of a special paint that reduced infrared emissions. They also developed paint that was far less glossy, and therefore less reflective. Of course, camo schemes also became more complex and scientific. A good example is the Do Tanks Camo, an experimental scheme designed by the US. It was a modified version of the emergency camo, the scheme that was standard for US tanks. But instead of smooth brushstrokes, it used blocky shapes. The idea was to create two patterns, a micro pattern and a macro pattern. One would conceal the tank up close, and the other would conceal it at range. It actually worked quite well, being a marked improvement over the regular emergency camo. It was also made with the assistance of computers, which hadn't really been done before. However, dual text was never adopted. Not only was camouflage creation more scientific, but camouflage testing became more scientific too. Beforehand, it was usually tested by simply taking the tank out and seeing how hard it was to spot. Simple, right? But it wasn't great at simulating a variety of conditions, and scheduling could often be ruined by adverse weather. In the United States, the Visual Perception Laboratory was built to remedy this. Images of vehicles could be changed to reflect certain conditions, and would then be shown to test participants. Concealment expanded to other areas as well. Ground radar can be used to track vehicle movement, so many nations experimented with radar-absorbing paint or materials. To reduce thermal signatures, some vehicles began mixing cool air with exhaust. Some companies even tried to develop active thermal camouflage. These are basically external tiles, kind of like ERA, but they can cool themselves to match the ambient temperature. To summarize, camouflage is used because armor is not a guarantee. Even for a large vehicle that is supposed to be able to take hits, it is always better if the enemy never knows you're there to begin with. Even with advanced detection systems, camouflage is still important, and actively being developed. Anyway, I hope that was at least somewhat informative. I'll see you guys on the next one.